Hi everybody, it's Mrs. Marr, and we're going to talk about the stages of clay and a little bit about wedging and some of the things that you should and shouldn't do with clay from the very start. So, one of the things that we're going to talk about is when you get your clay. When we get clay from the store, it comes in 25-pound bags and it's perfect. But as you work with it, you end up with little pieces and shards, and if you have tiny little shards, you can, at the end when you're cleaning up, you can put them in your slip bucket, and we'll use them to make almost like a peanut butter or cake batter consistency that we'll use to join two pieces of clay together. But bigger pieces, you're going to find in this video that clay dries out quickly. It also shrinks when it dries. But mostly it's hard to work with, and nobody wants to work with clay that's been left out that's all hard because you have to recondition it. So when you're done with your clay, or you're starting a new project and we have plenty of old clay to use, you're going to wedge it first. You have to wedge it because think about air. We know air expands. So if you have the wall of your vase, or you're making, and we're going to make apples and fruit and vegetables, if there's an air bubble in your clay and you put it in the kiln and the air expands and it has nowhere to go, it's going to explode or it's going to crack. And it might take out the one next to you, not just your project, but anything that's around it. So you want to be very careful not to get air bubbles. So one of the ways that we do that is to wedge the clay. And if the clay starts drying out, you can wet your hands a little bit. If your hands get too wet, it gets slippery. It's hard to do. But what you're going to do is you're going to put all your clay together and you're going to do something called wedging. And wedging is meant to get the air bubbles out. Now, it helps to stand up when you're wedging. So the key is not to make a pancake. Okay? You want to compress the clay. Imagine that there's a marble or something in the center. In this case, maybe an air bubble. And you want to compress it. So you're not going to go flat down and make a pancake, because then you just have to fold the pancake over again, and that's going to create air bubbles. So stop it from moving forward by putting your fingers there. Stop it from moving out by having this part of your hand there, and use the heel of your hand to press down and in. So you're pressing sort of diagonally towards the center of the clay. And then you put it sort of up on an end, and you keep doing that until you get the clay to be so compressed that you can't get you don't have any air bubbles in there. And you kind of get a feel for that eventually. But when you first start out, it helps to cut your clay and find out. So as I'm doing that, this is considered a ram's head technique, and you can see that there's cracks coming out to the edges, and you want that. You can't see it quite yet, but what you're going to end up with is a snout where your heels are, and then on the side you get this sort of ram's head pattern rolling around. You can kind of, I don't know if you can see this on camera, but it kind of rolls around like that. That's how you know you're doing it right. You're compressing the center and it's rolling out to the sides evenly. And then ultimately you squish your ram's head into a ball or whatever, cube or whatever shape you need for the project you're going to do. Okay? And to figure out if you have enough when you're just starting out, you can cut it in half and see if you have air bubbles in there. So this one's good. There's no air bubbles in there. Okay? You would know. It would kind of look like that if there was an air bubble and you cut it in half. That's what you'd see. Doesn't mean there's not an air bubble somewhere over here, but usually if you cut it in half and there's none, you're in pretty good shape. So there's another way that you can wedge, and that's kind of a 3/4 turn. So same deal, you're cupping the clay so it can't get flat, and you can kind of roll it about a 1/4 turn. Okay, and you just roll it a 1/4 and keep putting it up on its pointiest end, I guess you could say, until you've compressed all the air bubbles out of the clay. Okay, and then you're ready to use it. Okay, and like I said, if your hands if your clay is starting to dry out, because your hands will dry out your clay and your clay will dry out your hands. But if that's the case, you can always put a little water on your hands as you're working. Okay. Okay, so number 1 was wedging. Number 2, moisture in the clay. So there's some different stages that we're going to go through with every piece that we do. Okay, your clay has a lot of moisture in it. Clay is basically mud. There are things that are in there that are going to help to make it more flexible, and there's different kinds of clay that you would find in different places. Around here you can get mud out of a river. Not every river is, not all mud is clay. But say you were in Arizona, you might have terracotta clay, and it might be redder, and there might be more iron in it. So different clay in different places has different characteristics to it. Okay? But for our purposes, the clay is gray when it's got a lot of moisture in it. Okay, and it's easy to work with. As you go through the process, you can't put it in the kiln with all this moisture in it because it could crack. Okay, it could be that if you have the wall of, I don't know, say you have a vase and it's too thick in some areas, it may appear dry on the outside. You can't put it in the kiln until the moisture's out. But there could be moisture on the inside, and you don't see that because the outside is being affected by the air. It's going to take a little longer for the inside to dry out because it's not getting the direct effect of the air. So before it ever goes in the kiln, and we fire our kilns at about 2,000 degrees, give or take. When we bisque fire, it's about 1,800 probably. So this is pretty much like this clay. It's not even, I would say, leather hard at this point, but let's just say it's leather hard. It's beginning to hold its shape. It is very cold, and it's very gray, and that means that there's moisture in the clay. So before clay ever goes in the kiln, it's considered green ware, and there are 2 stages of green ware. The leather hard stage is cold, still damp. You can, if my leaf fell off, I could use some slip, stick it back on there, smooth it together, and fix it. Or if the handle fell off the mug, you could fix it easily. You can also carve into a surface. If you're creating something and you want a carved surface, you can do it. It's best to do it when it's leather hard. Okay? These are both, let's say these are leather hard. The next stage, before you put it in the kiln, is bone dry. The difference is, first of all, you can see the difference in the color. Okay, this one is much colder. It's heavier. This one is warmer, and the moisture is out of this clay. This one actually is left over from last March when we were quarantined, so it's been around for a long time. It's very dry. It's hard to tell sometimes if it's dry. Kind of depends on how thick the walls are. But at any rate, we could put this in the kiln now and bisque fire it because we're sure there's no moisture left in the clay. Once it goes in the kiln, it's no longer green ware. Once it goes in the kiln, the first time you put it in the kiln, it's called a bisque fire, B-I-S-Q-U-E. And there's a vitrification process that happens that makes the clay much harder. Okay, right now, bone dry is very fragile. This is fragile in the sense that you could squeeze it and it would cave in, but you could push it back together again. This, if I squeeze it, it'll crumble. If I bang it on the table, it will crack into pieces. Okay, so you want to make sure that anything you have to do to the surface to get it the way you want it happens when it's leather hard, because it's much easier to fix it and it's going to hold its shape. Once it's bone dry, it's much trickier to do that. And the more you play with it when it's bone dry, the more likely you are to break it. You never pick up anybody else's work for that reason. If you made a mug and you had a handle, if you picked it up when it's bone dry, well, you don't want to do it when it's leather hard either, but that handle will come off, will crumble in your hands, and your mug will crash to the ground. You can't, it won't support a lot of activity. This has a hole in the bottom. These all have a hole in the bottom because they're hollow. You never want anything as thick as an apple to go in the kiln. So this is hollowed out. You'll see that in the next video. the walls are about as thick as your pinky, which makes it a giant air bubble. So you need to have a hole so the air can get out. Otherwise, that's just one giant air bubble that's going to expand when it heats up. Okay? This one has a hole in the top and a hole in the bottom. So, bone dry, you fire it, bisque fire it, it vitrifies, and you get something like this. Now, I can mess with this. It's not that it would never break. If you try hard enough, you can break it. But the vitrification process makes it much more solid. It's also much harder to fix. This one, you can see all the fingerprints on it. That should have been dealt with when it was at this stage. So that, or this stage, you could even like sand it with a really rough sponge. You know, like the green side, the yellow and green sponge would make that nice and smooth when it's bone dry. This, you're not going to be able to change it. You don't want to say, oh, I'll sand it when it comes out of the kiln. You want to sand it before it goes in, or change whatever you have to change, or carve. You can't carve it once it comes out of the kiln. Okay? That's the other thing is, I don't know if you guys can hear that. Let me see. Whoop. Yeah. Oh, that just cracked off of that was bone dry stuff that was on the tool. When it's gone into the kiln and it's bisque ware, it sounds like that. When it's bone dry, that one sounds more like that. You can kind of tell the difference between a ping and a thud. If it's bone dry, you get more of a thud, and when it's been vitrified, it's more like it's kind of a process of turning it almost to glass, although not what we think of as clear glass. But it sounds more like a glass would sound. Next step, you're going to glaze it. That's an umbrella term for all different sorts of ways you can color it. There are other ways you can color it that aren't glazes, but for our purposes, there's lots of glazes that we'll use. Undercoats, underglazes, glazes. Bottom line is, you do your coloring, for the most part. There's a couple times when we use slip and we do it beforehand, but you're going to take your bisque ware. It's now, once it's been bisque fired, it's bisque ware, and you're going to glaze it. Okay? Glazes will change dramatically. We'll do a whole deal on glazes down the road. Glazes will change dramatically. So, for instance, okay, here's a banana to compare to. Compare that banana. No, you can't. Leather hard banana, bisque banana. Okay? Once it's been bisque fired, you put the glazes on. You probably need 3 coats of glaze. It will look, after 1 coat, it will look like it's done. But once it gets fired, it'll look very wishy-washy if there's only 1 coat on there. So you need 3, and you need to keep track. It's hard to keep track. So let 1 coat dry completely, otherwise you're just going to push it around. Do another coat. This will come out of the kiln when we glaze fire, the second firing, looking like this. It will be much more intense color. It'll be shinier. And then we call it glazeware. Okay, so you can go buy glazeware in a store. Okay, so those are the different stages, and that's some of the little things you need to think about as you're going through those stages. I can't wait to see what you guys do this semester. The best hint I can give you is on your virtual days, make sure you do all your planning and you come in ready to go. If you have questions, you can email me, you can ask me in a Google Meet, or as soon as you come in the door, ask any questions so that you can spend the full time you're in class doing the work. Okay, you're going to need every minute of it when you're only here 2 days a week. So, have a great day. Hope this helps you get excited about doing ceramics in the future. Bye now.